75% of my subjects, I had 81 people respond to the questionnaire, which was 16 pages long. It was quite a job to fill it out. And 75% of them reported an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca. And I sort of never recovered from that finding. That frankly just blew my mind. So these were Westerners talking about an ongoing, very therapeutic relationship with a spirit.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Sabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. We've got a great show in store for you today. We're going to be talking all about ayahuasca. Now, entheogens, psychedelics, ayahuasca in particular have been a topic that I've been talking about quite a bit with people recently, so I'm excited to be having this dialogue with the community. But I want to remind you, before we jump into the conversation, to go over to savannahspirit.com/contest. Enter in each week for the chance to win a $100 gift card that you can use on savannahspirit.com. It's our thank you for listening to and helping to support the show. Our guest today is psychologist Rachel Harris, who's the author of multiple books, including recently released Listening to Ayahuasca, New Hope for Depression, Addiction, PTSD, and Anxiety. She's received a National Institutes of Health New Investigators Award, has published more than 40 scientific studies in peer-reviewed journals, and has worked as a psychological consultant to Fortune 500 companies and the United Nations. She's also been in private practice for over 35 years. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
I'm very excited to have you on the show because I love the perspective that you bring to this conversation around entheogens and specifically ayahuasca. So I'm very fascinated in the work that you've done studying ayahuasca. So I was wondering if we could start, just if you could tell us a little bit about your background and what led you into the work that you're doing now that you also then eventually published this book.
Yes, I'd like to. Let me explain first that I've been both a researcher and a psychotherapist. So I write from both perspectives. And I sort of fell into my own experience of ayahuasca in Costa Rica. I had signed up for a retreat center that I thought was just a winter vacation. So it was a vacation on the beach and sunny, and it was February. I thought it was a great idea. And then all of a sudden, I realized they were doing ceremonies. And so I had the opportunity to participate. And I think this is a common story. People are sort of called by ayahuasca, sometimes not even realizing what it is. Sometimes people have dreams about ayahuasca and then begin to search out an opportunity. So there's kind of an interesting phenomenon that happens for many people in discovering this process.
And how did that experience for you in Costa Rica really inspire you then to do the research that you did, or we could say I don't know if you would classify it per se as, well, it was definitely formal research. It wasn't the typical double-blind study that is normally the case with a lot of this stuff in science in the West, but how did that lead you to do that type of work?
Well, the morning after my first ceremony, I woke up asking all the Western questions. How could this happen? How did this work? This was amazing. I relived an experience when my father died that was incredibly mystical and therapeutic for me. And I was just astounded that this had happened. I'd had experience with entheogens in my youth, which was quite a long while ago, but nothing this specific, and I was just fascinated. So my questions grew as my experience grew, but they were always therapeutic questions. How does this work? How do people integrate their experiences? How do they use the therapeutic opportunity here? And it led me to ask those questions in a research study in where I collected data in North America. So this was a study of the underground use in the United States and Canada. And my questions all focused on what happens after the ceremony. How are you changed? How are you different? What difference does it make? And it's just not possible at this point to do a double-blind study with ayahuasca. We can't control for potency and source, and we're not up to it yet. So this was the beginning level kind of survey research, and people wrote long essay questions. Well, I had essay questions. They wrote long answers to my questions and really shared from their hearts what their experience was and how they were changed. And that was always the focus. There had been previous research on the kinds of visions that people have. That work had been done, some content analysis of their visions. I was interested in what happens therapeutically and spiritually afterwards. And I touch on this research in the book, Listening to Ayahuasca, and you can see how the name of the title of the book comes, is that 75% of my subjects, I had 81 people respond to the questionnaire, which was 16 pages long. It was quite a job to fill it out. And 75% of them reported an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca. And I sort of never recovered from that finding. That frankly just blew my mind. So these were Westerners talking about an ongoing, very therapeutic relationship with a spirit, basically, something outside our normal Western worldview. That was the distinct finding from the research study I did, and that was published in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs in 2012.
Now, I know that you're also seemingly very well versed in a lot of the other research that's being done out there. You touch on some of the stuff in your book as well, and I kind of want to start from the more grounded place to say, well, what's happening in the brain? What's happening chemically that we know of when people are under the influence of ayahuasca?
Well, we don't know a lot yet, and that's not my highest level of expertise. But what I looked at was the functional MRI studies of psychedelics. And the leading researcher for that is a Brit, Robin Carhart Harris, or Robin Harris. I'm mixing the names up, but those are the three names he has. And he's writing really brilliant research articles because even though he's young, he has a background. You know, the education in England is so different from ours. He has a background in psychoanalysis as well as in cognitive neuroscience. So he's really, in some ways, on the leading edge of not just asking what parts of the brain light up under these psychedelic medicines, but what does that mean? What's the experience of that and the therapeutic outcome of which parts of the brain light up or don't light up? And one of the most amazing findings he's reporting is that the default mode network is darkened. And this is a broad network throughout the brain. It's not just one anatomical part. It's a network that pervades the brain. And it accounts for the self-talk that we have going on constantly. Sometimes it's critical. Sometimes it's just, I have to stop at the drugstore. But it's amazingly constant. It makes up 60 to 70% of what our brain is doing. This is an enormous task. And he describes it as sort of being the constant self-talk that supports the sense of self, the ego. And this is dampened during psychedelic ingestion. When they give someone psilocybin and put them in a functional MRI machine, it's quite something for a volunteer. But what they find is this function of the brain is darkened. So that means we're not talking to ourselves in the way that supports our usual sense of self, our usual ego. And that opens the opportunity for us to think and experience in very different, creative, new ways. And I think that's one of the most interesting trends in research that's been happening. So I report on that because ayahuasca is similar to the other psychedelics. And although we don't actually have the data specific to ayahuasca, we can imagine and probably predict that it's very similar to what happens under psilocybin or LSD. And therapeutically, this means that there's an opportunity to and here's the word that's used in the underground, recalibrate. We can recalibrate our personalities. Things get loose, our psychic architecture gets loosened up during these ceremonies, and we can begin to reset ourselves, reorganize our personality in different ways. And that's the golden opportunity in the days and weeks that follow a ceremony.
There's been this really fascinating thread that's been woven recently through all these different guests that we've had on the show, from people that work with high performance athletes to yogis to shamans and people that are working with various mind altering substances, and the discussion around the shutting down of the prefrontal lobes of the brain, where we store a lot of that kind of inner critic, inner dialogue, continuous chatting stuff. And as a yoga teacher, speaking to this as well, of how much of the practice centers around getting that part of the brain to quiet down for a different experience of being. Now, it doesn't inherently mean that this is a spiritual experience, but often people will equate this to a more spiritual experience. What's your opinion on the importance of that type of experience, especially in our modern day culture?
I think you had a phrase in there that you just spontaneously used. I should have written it down when you were talking, but it's a quieting down of our usual way of perceiving ourselves and perceiving the world. And I think that's the golden therapeutic opportunity. That's a chance to really change. I mean, the spontaneous changes that people report, I think they come from this spontaneous restructuring that happens. So, for instance, I knew someone who was working on becoming an alcoholic. He wasn't full-blown, but he was doing a pretty good job of it.
He was working on it, huh?
Yeah, it's a progressive disease, so he was into it, but not in major trouble yet, but he eventually would have been. One ayahuasca episode, he stopped drinking completely. And that's a common story. Even a common story around issues of depression or anxiety. It's quite remarkable, the spontaneous changes. And the other thing that I hadn't expected that I found out, and it's written about quite a lot, is people often change their health habits, including diet and exercise. This is part of what I mean by recalibrate, reset. There's a reorganization, a reprioritizing in life. These are fundamental changes, and I really sort of tweaked the psychology profession because we have been no good at helping people change their health habits. We have really failed, and that's why there's such a big diet industry, because we don't know how to get people to change what they eat. I think that's pretty obvious these days. But it happens spontaneously after a ceremony for many, many people. There's a spontaneous change in what are serious psychiatric illnesses. Now, that doesn't happen to everyone, and we don't know how to predict who's going to have that, what I actually call a miracle cure. But other people benefit in a more slowly unfolding way. So they may not be relieved of depression immediately, but over time, they may feel relief and feel that they're no longer depressed, or that they might stop drinking over time. So there seem to be different processes that happen. We have no clue why, or who heals in one direction or not, or who doesn't experience any healing. I mean, these are huge questions that will take decades to answer. But I can see that there's a pattern of some people, lucky people, have a spontaneous recovery, and others, there's a progression of development and healing.
You also talk about in your book about those in your line of work where there are people, and I don't remember the exact statistics that you quoted, but who are in essence untreatable or resistant to the treatment of psychotherapy or even the pharmacology behind it, where it just doesn't work for them. And it seems like some of your initial dances around, in particular ayahuasca, came from people wanting to seek other possible answers that perhaps they weren't getting from psychotherapy. How do you feel like going forward in the future, how these things might be able to integrate together for a more cohesive experience? I mean, again, we're probably very far away from something like this for all kinds of cultural and legal reasons, but how do you feel?
You can have hope.
Yeah.
We do have hope for this eventually. In the traditional research looking at antidepressants, what they usually divide into groups of one group will receive only the antidepressant, one group will receive only psychotherapy, and the third group is called the crossover group, and they get both the antidepressant and psychotherapy. And consistently, that crossover group that gets both kinds of treatment, they do the best. And I think the same will be found for people using ayahuasca or the other psychedelics. In the underground, they are really using these medicines to treat depression and anxiety and the whole list in the title, PTSD and trauma. And I think the people who combine the medicine experience with psychotherapy will consistently do the best. And that's my hope for the future. And a good part of the book, I share my own process, my own therapeutic working with my experience, working with other people's experiences therapeutically, to kind of give examples and models for, look, this is how you can do this. Most of the integration material and kind of help at this stage of the game is advice about, in the days following the ceremony, give yourself time to be quiet, stay on the limited diet in preparation for the ayahuasca ceremony. They're kind of a meditative, relaxing, nourishing approach. And I'm interested in integration and the therapeutic opportunity. So I'm really saying, there's more that you can do in those days and weeks following a ceremony. But for many of us, we'll need a psychotherapist who understands this process. And I'm hoping there are more and more people willing to do that kind of therapy.
You mentioned a story of how the Navajo could respond to someone or would respond to someone who just came back from a vision quest. What do you feel like the world would look like if practices and medicines like these were more commonplace in our own culture?
Wouldn't that be wonderful? They're really treated and respected in special ways as having gone on a spiritual journey and returned to the community, and the community sort of awaits their contribution, what they have to bring back to the community. And yes, that would be quite a different culture we would have if that were true. So I remember a psychiatrist no less, who asked me about ayahuasca and that sort of thing. And one of the things I said to him was, be sure to give yourself a few days after the ceremony. Don't schedule yourself, the next day. But he didn't listen. He didn't understand that he needs to give himself time to mull over the experience. So even therapists, this is a clinical psychiatrist, even therapists don't understand right away that this is a process of healing that requires time and sometimes quiet and sometimes help from another therapist.
And you've mentioned this a few times, and it's something that I personally think about a lot, both on kind of large-scale things. I lived abroad for a number of years and still struggle with this today, even though I've been back in the United States now for 5 years. But it also fits around the context specifically of right after working with particular entheogens, and that's this idea of how do we integrate these experiences back into our normal, waking, everyday, 9 to 5 lives that we have in the modern world?
Yes, that really has been my focus all along. How do you change? How are you different? And the ways people report that they've changed are basically the same as the goals of psychotherapy. People feel better about themselves. Their relationships improve. Their health habits improve. They suffer with less depression and anxiety. They have more objectivity, even about trauma from their histories. So this is what we look for in psychotherapy too. How do we know whether a client is improving? Well, their relationships are improving. They're suffering with less mood disorder. So these are the way people report being different afterwards is very similar to the goals of psychotherapy. How it makes a difference in the bigger culture, I think, is what you keep asking about. And that's a difficult question, especially in these times. All I can say is I felt I received a mission to do the initial research and to write this book. And I personally have risen to that mission. I have risen to that challenge, and it's been almost a 10-year project. And so, I've written this book in the hopes that it will be helpful to people who are using the medicine. It will give them ways to work more with their experience that's more therapeutic, and also that it can serve as kind of a template for psychotherapists working with people using ayahuasca. So, this is my little job to contribute to the bigger world.
Well, let's take it down to the smaller aspect, as it were, although it's obviously very grand, but or perhaps the more appropriate word is the personal aspect with entheogen use. What advice, based on all the research, based on everything that you've experienced yourself and with people that you've interviewed, what advice could you give to people looking to integrate these experiences into their own lives? Do you recommend that everyone go see a psychiatrist after this work, or is there something
No, not a psychiatrist. There aren't going to be many who would be able to work with people using any of the entheogens. Not many would be able to. So it would be, at best, a therapist who has their own personal experience and is willing to let you know that they have had this experience. I mean, that's the best situation possible. But there aren't going to be many of those kinds of therapists around for a while. So then the next, and of course, I'm a proponent of psychotherapy, but that's not always possible. And so in the book, I give examples of how people can do their own work and what does their experience mean in their lives. So even, for instance, I'm on my website, listeningtoayahuasca.com, I've put a section in where people can write me a question about their experience, and I'll answer one question a week and just reflect on it. This is not medical or therapeutic advice. It's my reflections. And the first question had to do with someone experiencing a lot of anxiety during a ceremony. And, there's a lot of information about harm reduction at different music festivals to minimize any of the risks of psychedelic use. But the therapeutic question is, what role does anxiety play in your life? This is not just an off experience because of a psychedelic. What issues do you have around anxiety in your ongoing life, and how do you deal with them? And how's that working for you? So it's those kinds of questions and reflections that go beyond the experience into, what does this mean for my life? So it's that broader question. And so that involves generally therapeutic work of some sort.
How valuable are other support structures, whether it be family or friends or community, in learning how to integrate these types of experiences, or even having just a voice with someone to share these things with, in terms of the overall integration of the experience itself?
Many people are, if they're using ayahuasca, often they're in a circle of people also using ayahuasca, and those relationships become a real source of friendship and sharing and mutual support, and that's very helpful. I mean, the image of being in a ceremony over the weekend and returning to office work Monday morning where people say, "How was your weekend?" and you have to lie about what you did because of the legal complications, that's very difficult. So there's a great benefit that can come from the kind of sharing that goes on spontaneously, so that someone a week later could contact a friend from the medicine group and say, "Listen to my dream. I had this amazing dream. Let me just tell you about it." And that's also very therapeutic and helpful. But these are informal structures that happen spontaneously as people share experiences and develop relationships.
So something that I get a lot, people will ask me about various entheogens or ayahuasca in particular, because it seems to be so popular kind of in the underground, as you're mentioning now. Just in terms of, they'll say things like, "Well, I'm really afraid of using this stuff," and my kind of initial response is like, "Good," because I mean that means you have a level of respect for it. It's like people that surf 50-foot waves. If you don't have a fear of it, that means to me that you don't respect it, and you're more likely to get hurt through the experience. But as far as you know, with the research that you've seen, what are the risks for people in working with medicines like this?
Oh, well, the risks are substantial they are still a small percentage of people who are using it, and the research is showing that psychedelics used in a very safe, supportive situation, people do not have problems, but they're also screened for psychiatric illnesses, so those people are not included. So there are significant risks, and with ayahuasca, even more so, because it's an indeterminate mixture from two plants, and who knows what's really in it. Some people some of the ayahuasca may have a third plant in it, the datura, that's a dangerous drug. So there have been stories of rape in Latin America and South America, and stories of people having a psychotic break. Maybe they have a history of psychosis. So there is substantial risk. And also, it's not an easy experience. It's a very challenging, demanding experience that's a very strong psychedelic and also involves often purging, which means vomiting or going to the bathroom. Hopefully there's a bathroom, but either, however it works. So it's not a fun. This medicine is not used recreationally. It's a working medicine. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I don't know how the risks. I don't know how this. People just have to be very careful. There is no systematic way to really know what's safe. You have to really do your homework before you imbibe. And it's a serious decision.
And you bring up two things as well, and one is this idea, first of all, that the word shaman never existed in Central and South American cultures, where these have been ritually used for probably thousands of years. It's a recent term that was brought to them. So they themselves are ayahuasqueros or vegelistas or a whole other range of medicine people that, as you said, might be working quite differently with the medicine, where it's not the simple two components that people often associate with the ayahuasca brew. But I worked with a shaman in South America that was a vegilista. He was bringing in all kinds of tree barks, and datura was also present in the medicine. And that, as you said, can be a very dangerous component to it as well. The way that they describe it is that the spirit behind her grants a lot of power, a lot of visions, but she's very possessive. Sometimes she doesn't give people back, and people literally lose their minds to this medicine. And as well, there's the experience itself that you touched upon, where one of my experiences in South America, there was a woman that was there, and she was a social worker, and she'd been working with the medicine for a previous year already, but she was reliving a molestation experience from her father and her father's friends over and over through her experiences. I can only imagine that without the therapeutic container to process that work, that's just walking into reliving abuse over and over. That, to me, in and of itself, isn't necessarily therapeutic. Obviously, there's an element of trusting where the medicine is taking people, but I think that support element, whether it is psychotherapy or a community or something else, can be really vital in learning how to not only experience healthily in a healthy way, but also to integrate these experiences back into life in a way that really is supportive to our life instead of detrimental to our life.
That's a great example, and I would be very concerned with that example of reliving a trauma, almost like you're stuck in a cycle of reliving it. It's one thing to relive it once, maybe twice, and move through it in some way and begin to get a different perspective. But to be caught in a recurring reliving of trauma, I would be very worried therapeutically for that person. And what can change that is the work that they do outside the ceremony, so that they don't keep going back to that same issue. It's a real call for a therapeutic intervention. These kinds of intense experiences are not always therapeutic in and of themselves. Often they really require some working through.
At this point, with the work that you do you see yourself going more in the direction of supporting people that are curious about these experiences, or more down the therapeutic side, where you're supporting other therapists who want to understand this medicine more, so we can more, from a cultural perspective, integrate this into various types of legitimate scientific work?
Well, certainly the research I did was a call for more research. So that is a part of my message. We need more research, and I understand that will take decades. But yes, we need more research into the therapeutic value of all the entheogens. And I hope my book is useful for people thinking about trying ayahuasca, and so that they're cautioned and have ways to consider their decision thoughtfully. And that it opens up avenues for working on themselves for people who have already had ceremony experience. And I hope it provides guidance for therapists working with such people. So I'm really, this is part of my mission that I feel I received in my own experiences with ayahuasca, is to share this information as broadly as possible and to have, for whoever can benefit from it. The intention of the book is really to be helpful at whatever level it can be helpful, and always grounded in the therapeutic questions of how are you different? How have you changed? What's better? Possibly what's worse? How did you deal with it? I mean, for instance, I had one guy I followed up 6 years later after he filled out an original research questionnaire for me, and he'd come home from an ayahuasca ceremony and was alone and had such an anxiety attack that he went to an emergency room. And so, we have to learn from that kind of experience that some people cannot be just left alone. They need more continued care, actually, after an experience. And so the community, the underground community, has to take more responsibility to care for each other after the experience.
What is it going to take for this in the United States, for example, to shift from underground to more socially accepted? I mean, we see things like marijuana, for example, getting legalized in so many states. That's starting to shift now. We see huge business executives talking about microdosing with LSD and things like that. So there's definitely shifts happening. What do you think will be the threshold that brings this more into the common experience? Is it just the research? Is it the data? Is it a perception change from the public or from government? Where does that shift happen?
Well, it's interesting. You really covered the waterfront there of how the shift happens. And with the marijuana changes in the law, that's one way the shift is happening. And that's from public pressure. That's from below. People are finding that marijuana is helpful for a wide variety of medical problems. And so they've really pushed the legislature to change the laws. That's movement from below. The research into entheogens and marijuana to a certain extent also is from above, from the profession above, finding the therapeutic value in these medicines. So far, the public pressure from below, finding these medicines to be helpful, is actually stronger. It's working more quickly. And the legislatures and public policy is responding. So we see the process going on right in front of our eyes. So whether the change comes from below or from above, from the research, it's hopefully it's beginning to change the whole culture. So the executives and, Silicon Valley microdosing, that's change from below, but those people are influencers in the culture, so that they're going to have a big impact. So it's a very interesting process to watch, but you pretty much covered the two directions that the change is coming from.
Well, this is really, really fascinating, and I'm happy that your work is there. I really encourage for people to read your book, Listening to Ayahuasca. It does a really great job of covering personal stories as well as covering areas of research, both the research that you did, but also some other areas of work that other people are doing. And you talk about some older studies that were done. I love hearing about some of your experiences with Esalen and things like that too, more in the Good Friday experiments and that whole thing. So for people listening, definitely go check out your book. Where's the best way? You mentioned your website earlier, and perhaps you can just give it to us again. We'll make sure it's in the show notes. But tell us about your website and where people can connect to you and the work that you do.
Well, I would say go to the website, listeningtoayahuasca.com, and there's a place to connect to me on the website, and that's the way to reach me. And I'm retired. I'm no longer in private practice. I put my 35 years in, and I figured that was enough in private practice, a decade in research. I was really called to do this study and to write this book and to make whatever contribution I could, but I'm not building a business here. I'm just trying to contribute to the flow that's already happening.
I have one more question kind of outside the context of everything, but as a parent, obviously I'm at a different stage of parenthood. My daughter's only 5 years old, I believe.
Oh, yeah, that's a little different.
Yeah. I'm curious, because you mentioned it in your book about the transition of, your daughter was old enough, she was out of the house, so you felt free enough to go explore some of these things. Do you, even though she is older, so it's a different context, do you talk to your daughter, or have you talked to your daughter about these experiences? Specifically, I mean, outside just the psychiatrist mode of things, but just person to person of your deep ayahuasca experiences?
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful. And has she been open to and receptive or interested in this type of experience as well?
She has no interest.
No interest. As children typically would be.
Remarkable.
If mom and dad are into it, I don't want anything to do with it.
Possibly.
Okay.
I remember I dragged her up to Omega Institute when she was maybe 4 years old when I was giving a workshop there. So she's had plenty of exposure. And she made a point in her own traveling, over summers outside, out of college and that sort of thing, to go through Big Sur and sleep on the beach and that kind of thing. But no, she has not had interest in this regard. She's a classical musician, and she's on a different path.
Rachel, thank you so much for coming on the show today, for sharing your research, your personal experiences and everything else. I appreciate, again, the work that you're doing and the insights that you bring. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
And for all of our listeners out there, I hope you have learned something new today. Please do go and check out Rachel Harris's new book, Listening to Ayahuasca. I hope you all have a very present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, it's Ashton here with an announcement. We're starting a weekly contest giveaway over at Savannah Spirit. If you'd like to enter into the contest to win one of our weekly prizes, go to savannahspirit.com/contest. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, we'd really appreciate it if you went over to iTunes, left us a review, leave us some comments, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy it. Also want to invite you to go check out Savannah East, which is the name of our blog and also the name of a Facebook group where I interact with guests and our audience. We'll post recent episodes up there as well as interesting articles relating to our guests and or the topics on the shows. And again, thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaheast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.